In the winter of 1971, in the high-veld city of Pretoria, South Africa, a child was born who would one day reshape entire industries. His name was Elon Musk. He arrived on the 28th of June, into a country divided by apartheid, into a household divided by tension, and into a mind that would prove almost impossible to categorize. Pretoria in the early 1970s was a city of jacaranda trees and administrative buildings, the seat of South Africa's government, and one of the wealthiest, most segregated urban centers in the country. It was here that Elon Musk, an ambitious electromechanical engineer, and May Musk, a Canadian-born model and dietitian, began raising their first son. Errol had grown up with a fascination for machines and a talent for building things with his hands. May had grown up performing on stages and in front of cameras, one of 5 children raised largely by a single mother after her own parents' complicated history. Between them, they gave Elon 2 inheritances that would define the rest of his life: an obsessive engineering mind and an unshakable comfort with public attention. But a happy inheritance is not the same as a happy childhood. Elon's parents divorced when he was still young, and custody arrangements shifted over the following years. For a time, he and his 2 younger siblings, Kimball and Tosca, lived with their mother, who worked multiple jobs simultaneously just to keep the household running. Later, around the age of 9, Elon made the decision to live primarily with his father. It is a decision he would later describe in adulthood as one of the more painful mistakes he made as a child, though at the time it seemed to promise stability, a house, a sense of permanence. What it delivered instead was something more complicated. Elon Musk was, by every account that has surfaced over the decades, a difficult man to grow up under. He held strong opinions and did not hesitate to share them, and Elon has since spoken about periods of severe verbal abuse, moments of humiliation dressed up as discipline. There were also, by various accounts, allegations of physical violence within the household, though Errol himself has disputed the harshest characterizations. What is not disputed is that Elon's home life did not offer him refuge, and if home did not offer refuge, school offered even less. Elon was intellectually gifted in a way that made him stand out long before he had the social skills to manage that visibility. He started school a year earlier than his peers, which meant he was younger, smaller, and more awkward than the boys around him. He struggled to read social cues, to catch the unspoken rules that guide childhood friendships. He would later describe himself as having difficulty parsing tone and body language, and would speculate that his brain was simply wired differently, a suspicion that decades later he would voice publicly, and that many people would recognize in their own children after hearing him speak about it. Different, in the culture of a 1970s and 1980s South African boys' school, was dangerous. Elon was bullied, and not in the mild sense the word sometimes implies. He was mocked, isolated, chased, and beaten. On one occasion, the abuse escalated to a level that required hospitalization. A group of boys threw him down a flight of concrete stairs, and then continued the assault once he was on the ground, striking him until he lost consciousness. He woke up in a hospital bed with a face so swollen his own family struggled to recognize him. He was around 15 years old. It would be simple and satisfying to say that Elon overcame this bullying through some singular act of teenage courage, a training montage ending in triumph. The truth is less cinematic and more human. He endured it. He absorbed blow after blow, both literal and otherwise, for years, because there was no alternative on offer. Eventually, in his mid-teens, a growth spurt gave him size he hadn't had before, and he began training in wrestling and karate, in part so that the next time violence came looking for him, he would not simply have to take it. But the years before that growth spurt left their mark. People who have studied his life closely have pointed to this period as the root of something that would follow him for the rest of his career, an almost frightening tolerance for conflict, criticism, and pain, alongside a certain wariness about trusting other people's intentions. If the physical world offered Elon very little comfort as a child, other worlds did. He became a voracious reader, the kind of child who could disappear for an entire day inside a book and emerge having absorbed it completely. He read the encyclopedia cover to cover, not as an assignment but for pleasure, absorbing facts about physics, biology, history, and engineering with the same appetite other children reserved for cartoons. He read science fiction obsessively, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and later Douglas Adams, whose Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would leave a permanent imprint on how Elon thought about humanity's cosmic situation. These books did more than entertain him, they gave him a framework. Asimov's foundation novels in particular planted an idea that Elon would return to again and again in interviews decades later. The notion that civilizations can fall, that knowledge and progress are not guaranteed to continue, and that someone somewhere has to actively work to preserve and extend the light of human civilization, rather than assume it will simply persist on its own. At times, his parents worried that his daydreaming was a medical problem. He would drift so completely into his own thoughts, oblivious to the world around him, that doctors examined his hearing to check whether he was simply failing to hear the people speaking to him. His hearing was fine. He was simply somewhere else, mentally, running through ideas that had nothing to do with the room he was physically standing in. Around the age of 10, Elon's attention turned toward a machine that would change the direction of his life: the computer. His father bought him one of the early personal computers of the era, and Elon approached it the way he approached everything that interested him, which is to say completely and without half measures. He taught himself to program, working through manuals and code examples with a discipline that startled the adults around him. Within roughly 2 years, by the age of 12, he had written an entire video game from scratch. It was called Blastar, a space combat game in the vein of the arcade games popular at the time, in which the player defended against invading alien spacecraft carrying deadly cargo. He sold the code for the game to a computer magazine for approximately $500, a genuinely remarkable sum for a South African schoolboy to earn through nothing but self-taught code in the early 1980s. It was his first taste of turning an idea, built alone in his own head, into something the outside world would pay for. It would not be his last. Elon's teenage years were shaped by two competing forces: the confines of the world he had been born into, and an increasingly clear sense that he did not intend to stay within those confines forever. South Africa in the 1980s was a country under enormous internal and international pressure. The apartheid regime, which enforced brutal racial segregation and denied basic rights to the black majority population, was facing growing unrest at home and mounting sanctions from abroad. For a white teenage boy from a comfortable, though emotionally difficult household, this meant growing up inside a bubble of relative privilege while conflict simmered around the edges of that bubble. It also meant that, as a young white South African man, Elon faced the prospect of mandatory conscription into the country's military once he came of age, an army that at the time was actively enforcing apartheid policy and engaged in regional conflicts that many young men had no interest in fighting. Elon did not want to serve in that military, but his reasons for wanting to leave South Africa were broader than avoiding conscription alone. He had since childhood been captivated by the idea of America, and specifically by Silicon Valley, which by the 1980s had already become synonymous in his mind with the frontier of technology and opportunity. He has said that even as a boy he sensed that if he wanted to build the kinds of things he dreamed about, he would eventually need to be in the United States. The challenge was that he had no direct path there. What he did have was his mother's Canadian citizenship. At 17 years old, having just finished high school, Elon made his move. Rather than traveling straight for the United States, which would have been legally complicated without a visa or a job offer, he set his sights on Canada, a country he had never lived in but held citizenship in through his mother's birth. He first briefly enrolled at the University of Pretoria, attending classes for about 5 months, largely as a way of building a small financial cushion and buying time while he arranged his departure. Then in 1989 he boarded a flight and left South Africa, alone with very little money, heading toward a country and a continent he barely knew. The early months in Canada were far from glamorous. Elon stayed for a period with distant relatives, moving between towns, taking whatever work he could find to support himself. He shoveled grain out of a barn, cleaned out boiler rooms in a lumber mill, chopped wood, and worked a series of physically exhausting, low-paying jobs, the kind of labor that offers no clues that the person performing it will one day found companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But Elon treated this period as a necessary bridge rather than a destination. He enrolled at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he began his university studies, and it was there that he also crossed paths, however briefly and informally, with people and ideas that widened his sense of what might be possible. After 2 years at Queen's, Elon transferred to the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, drawn by its strong economics and physics programs, and by his long-standing ambition to eventually make his way into American technology circles. At Penn, he pursued a dual course of study, earning a degree in physics and a degree in economics from the Wharton School, a combination that reflected the two halves of his thinking that would later define his companies: a physicist's obsession with first principles, and a businessman's instinct for markets, capital, and scale. It was also during his university years that Elon began to sketch out, in conversation with friends and later in more formal terms, a short list of what he believed were the most important problems facing humanity, problems he wanted to spend his life working on if he could find a way in. The list included the transition to sustainable energy, the extension of human life beyond a single planet, the development of artificial intelligence in a way that benefited rather than endangered humanity, and the reprogramming of the human genome. At the time, this list sounded less like a business plan, and more like the kind of thing an idealistic young physics student says at 2 in the morning. Few people who heard him describe it in the early 1990s could have predicted that he would spend the following 3 decades methodically building companies aimed directly at nearly every item on it. After finishing his studies at Penn, Elon was accepted into a PhD program in applied physics and materials science at Stanford University, drawn by Stanford's proximity to Silicon Valley and its work in energy storage, an area he was already circling in his mind as critical to the future. He arrived on campus in 1995, at the height of the early internet boom, with a plan to study high-energy density capacitors, technology that might one day allow electric vehicles to compete with gasoline cars. But the pull of the internet, exploding all around him in real time, proved too strong to ignore. Just 2 days into his graduate program, Elon made the decision to leave Stanford, a decision that startled his professors and, by his own account, unsettled him as well, given how much weight his family and his younger self had placed on academic achievement. He believed the internet represented a once-in-a-generation opportunity, a wave that would not wait for him to finish a doctorate before it broke. With that decision, Elon Musk closed the door on one possible version of his life, the version where he became a physicist working quietly in a lab on capacitor technology, and opened the door on another, far less certain path. He had no funding, no company, and no guarantee that anyone would care about the idea taking shape in his head, a piece of software that would help businesses put local city guides and information onto this strange, sprawling new thing called the internet. He and his brother Kimball, who had also made his way to North America, pooled together what little money they had, borrowed more from their father, rented a small office, and began writing code. By any conventional measure, the boy who left South Africa at 17 with almost nothing had already lived several lifetimes worth of hardship and reinvention before he turned 25. He had survived a childhood shaped by isolation and violence, both inside his home and outside it. He had built and sold his first piece of software before he was old enough to drive. He had crossed an ocean essentially alone, worked labor jobs to survive, talked his way into 2 of North America's most respected universities, and then walked away from a doctorate at Stanford because he believed, correctly, that the future was moving faster than academia could keep pace with. None of what came next, the companies, the rockets, the electric cars, the extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary controversy, happened by accident. The seeds of all of it were planted in those early years, in a lonely boy's discovery that books and code offered an escape that other people could not take away from him, in a teenager's decision that a violent, segregated country was not going to be the whole of his story, in a young man's willingness to abandon a prestigious, secure academic path the moment he sensed something bigger moving in the world around him. The story of Elon Musk's early life is, in the end, a story about the specific and often uncomfortable conditions under which certain kinds of drive are formed. It does not offer a simple lesson, and it resists easy sentimentality. It is not a story about a happy childhood producing a confident adult. It is a story about a difficult, sometimes brutal childhood producing an adult who learned, very early and very thoroughly, that the world would not protect him, that comfort was not guaranteed, and that if he wanted a different future for himself and, as he saw it, for the species he belonged to, he would have to go out and build it himself, one machine, one company, one obsession at a time. That building was only just beginning. But the tools he would use to do it, the relentless self-teaching, the tolerance for isolation, the appetite for risk, and the strange, science fiction-inflected sense that civilization itself needed defending, had already been forged, quietly and painfully, in a childhood far from the spotlight that would one day follow him everywhere he went.